Margaret
Oh
Hendricks stood in the
my
dark corridor and
God.
felt her hands shake. She did not know why she was shaking. She was a woman who did not shake easily. For 31 years, she had walked through the halls of Buckingham Palace at dawn and dusk, when the tourists were gone and the palace belonged only to the people who worked there. She knew every floor, every wall, every door by heart. She could walk these corridors with her eyes closed and never hit a single thing. But this morning, something was different. This morning, her heart was beating in a way that told her something was wrong. Margaret was 62 years old. She had started working at the palace when she was 31, a young widow with a son to raise and not much money to do it with. The palace job had saved her life. It gave her steady work. It gave her respect. It gave her a reason to wake up every morning and do something that mattered. Her son was grown now, with his own job and his own family. He worked in accounting. He lived a normal life. He did not know very much about what his mother did. But Margaret was proud of her work. She was proud that she took care of the palace. She was proud that she kept things clean and neat and in order. She was proud that nobody ever noticed what she did, because that meant she did it perfectly. The cleaning cart was heavy this morning, or maybe it just felt heavy. Margaret was tired. She had not slept very well. Her daughter-in-law was having problems with her marriage, and Margaret had spent the evening on the telephone listening to her troubles. Marriage problems, money problems, problems with the children. Margaret knew about these things. Her own life had been full of them. But now, at 62, she wanted to think that life should be easier. She wanted to think that the young people should have it better than she did. The East Wing third-floor corridor was very quiet. No one else was up here at this hour. The tourists never came to this part of the palace. Even the other staff members rarely came here. This was the working heart of the palace, the place where the actual decisions happened. This was where the people who kept the institution running did their jobs. Margaret respected this space. She came here twice a week, every Tuesday and Saturday, to check on things and make sure nothing needed fixing. It was routine work. Nothing ever changed. Nothing ever broke. That was the way Margaret liked it. The door marked 347 was waiting for her, the same as always. It was a heavy wooden door painted dark green. The door number was very small, written on a brass plate. The lock was brass too, old brass that had turned a little green over the years. Margaret had read somewhere that this kind of thing was called patina. It meant the metal was getting old. The lock had been there since 1952, she had heard someone say. That was a long time. That was before Margaret was born. That was before Margaret's son was born. That was before a lot of things. She reached up to examine the lock. This was something she did every time she came here. She looked at the metal. She looked at the scratch marks around the keyhole. She looked at the small space where the key went in. She was not checking for any special reason. It was just part of her routine, part of taking care of things, part of making sure nothing was wrong. But this time something was wrong. Margaret's fingers felt the scratches before her eyes saw them. The metal around the keyhole was different. There were new marks, small scratches, fresh scratches, the kind of scratches that came from tools. Someone had been working on this lock. Recently, maybe in the last few days, maybe yesterday, someone had used small tools to do something to this lock. Someone had opened it or had tried to open it or had done something to it that Margaret could not quite understand. She stepped back from the door. Her heart was beating faster now. She could feel it in her chest. She could feel it in her throat. She could feel it in her fingertips. She looked down at the floor beneath the lock. There, catching the early morning light, were tiny pieces of brass. Very tiny pieces. The kind of pieces that come off when you work on old metal with the wrong tools or with tools used in the wrong way. Someone had been working on this lock very recently. Someone had scratched it. Someone had damaged it. Margaret did not touch the lock again. She knew that was important. If something was broken, you did not touch it more. She stepped away from the door slowly. She felt her legs were not quite steady beneath her. She had been doing this job for 31 years, and nothing like this had ever happened. Nothing was ever broken. Nothing was ever wrong. The palace was a place where things stayed the same. She thought about calling someone, but she did not know who to call. She thought about telling another staff member, but she had no one to tell. Most of the other workers did not start their shifts for several more hours. Margaret was always the first one here because she liked to work alone. She liked the quiet. She liked the way the palace felt when it was empty. But now the empty palace did not feel safe. Now the empty palace felt like something was happening that she did not understand. Margaret walked to the nearest phone on the wall. It was a red phone, very old, the kind that had been there for many years. She picked it up. Her hands were still shaking. She did not recognize her own voice when she started to speak. She asked for the chief of palace operations. She had only called this number once before, 7 years ago, when a pipe in the basement had burst and flooded one of the storage rooms. The person who answered was not the chief. It was someone else. Margaret explained what she had found. She told about the scratches. She told about the brass pieces on the floor. She told about the way the lock had been damaged by someone using tools. She tried to keep her voice steady and professional, the way she had been trained. But inside her chest, her heart was still beating in that strange, fast way. The person on the phone told her to wait exactly where she was. The person said that someone would come to her. The person said, "Do not let anyone touch the door. Do not let anyone near it. Just wait." Margaret hung up the phone and stood in the corridor with her cleaning cart in her shaking hands. She looked at the door with the broken lock. She thought about who might have done this. She thought about why someone would damage a lock on a door in this part of the palace. She thought about all the things she did not understand, and she realized that her safe, quiet, steady job had just become something else. The palace was still the palace, but now it was a palace with a secret, and Margaret was the person who had found it. She waited in the corridor and watched the door, and she wondered what was going to happen next. The security officers came much faster than Margaret expected. She had been standing in the corridor for only 7 minutes when she heard their footsteps. 2 men in dark uniforms walking quickly down the hallway. Their shoes made hard sounds on the stone floor. The palace hallways were usually quiet. The sound of these shoes was not quiet. The sound meant something serious was happening. The first officer was a man named James. Margaret did not know his last name. She had seen him many times in the palace, but they had never spoken. He was a tall man with gray hair and a face that did not show much emotion. The second officer was younger, maybe in his 30s. His name was David. He looked nervous. His eyes looked at the door and then looked away. He looked at Margaret and then looked away. He was the kind of person who did not like things that were wrong or different. James asked Margaret to show him exactly what she had found. Margaret pointed at the lock. She showed him the scratches. She showed him the tiny brass pieces on the floor. James looked at the lock for a long time without saying anything. Then he used his radio to call someone. He said that the lock had been tampered with. He said they needed to open the door. He said they needed to do it carefully. His voice was calm and quiet, but Margaret could hear something underneath the calm. She could hear that he was worried about something. More people came. A woman in a gray suit who said she was from the security department. 2 other officers. Someone with a camera who took pictures of the lock and the floor and the scratches. All these people standing in the quiet hallway that was supposed to be empty at this hour. The tourists would be arriving soon. Soon there would be thousands of people walking through the public rooms of the palace. But here in the East Wing, something was happening that nobody knew about. The woman in the gray suit was named Catherine. She was older than Margaret, maybe in her 70s. She had thin gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked like the kind of person who made important decisions. She stood very straight. She looked at Margaret with eyes that seemed to see everything. She asked Margaret questions about when she first noticed the problem. She asked about Margaret's routine. She asked if Margaret had ever seen anyone near this door before. Margaret answered all the questions carefully. She wanted to be helpful. She wanted this to be over. She wanted to go back to her normal life where nothing was wrong. Then Catherine did something that made everything more frightening. She asked one of the officers to open the door. Not with the key. They did not have a key. They opened it with tools. Small metal tools. Tools that looked like the tools that must have been used to damage the lock in the first place. The door opened very slowly. Everyone waited. Everyone was quiet. Everyone was watching to see what was inside. The door opened and showed a dark room. A storage room, just like Margaret had always thought. Old furniture. Wooden chairs with broken seats. A painting with a torn canvas. Boxes that had been here for so long that nobody could remember what was inside them. This was what Margaret expected. This was what made sense. But then Catherine asked the officers to move the furniture, to move the boxes. to look at what was behind them. And that was when everything changed. Behind the old furniture and the boxes, there was another space. A small office. A very small office that should not have been here. There was a desk with a chair. There were filing cabinets. There was a small cot like a bed. There was a lamp. There was a cup on the desk with old coffee inside it, turned brown and hard. There was paper everywhere. Files. Documents. Notes written by hand. A whole room inside the room. A hidden place where someone had been working. Someone had been living here. Someone had been spending time here in secret. Margaret felt her knees become weak. She held onto her cleaning cart to keep herself from falling. This was in her palace. This was in the building she had been taking care of for 31 years. Someone had been living in this hidden room the whole time. Someone had been here when Margaret came to clean. Someone had been here when the tourists walked through the palace. Someone had been hiding inside this locked door. Catherine began to look through the papers without touching them. She used a small stick to move things around. The papers had writing on them. Lists, names, dates, numbers. Margaret could not read what they said, but she could see that these were important papers. These were official papers. These were papers about the palace itself. Someone had been collecting information about the palace. Someone had been hiding in this small room and collecting information about where Margaret worked. The younger officer, David, looked very pale. He went to the corner of the corridor and put his hand on the wall. Margaret thought he might be sick. She understood why. This was the kind of thing that broke people's trust. This was the kind of thing that made you wonder about everywhere you went. If this room had been hidden in the palace for so long without anyone knowing, what else was hidden? What else did you not know about the place where you worked every day? Catherine used her radio to call someone very important. She said there had been a breach. She said they had found evidence of unauthorized access. She said they had found a hidden office inside a storage room. She said they needed the director. She said they needed to call someone very high up. She did not say the king's name, but everybody knew who she meant when she said someone very high up. After Catherine made the call, everything seemed to happen in fast motion and also in slow motion at the same time. More people came. More cameras. Someone drew lines on the floor with chalk to show where things were. Someone put a tape around the door that said, "Do not enter." Margaret was asked to tell her story again to a different person. And then another person asked her to tell it again. By the time Margaret finished telling her story the third time, her voice was tired. Her legs hurt from standing. Her heart was no longer beating fast. It was beating slow and heavy like a sad thing. She realized that she had opened something that could not be closed again. She had found something that would change everything about the palace. She had found it by accident, just by noticing that the lock did not look right, and now the whole palace would be different because of what she had found. Catherine told Margaret to go home. She said that Margaret should not come back until she was called. She said that Margaret had done a very good thing by noticing the problem. But Margaret did not feel like she had done a good thing. She felt like she had broken something. She felt like she had brought bad news into the palace. She felt like the quiet life she had lived for 31 years was finished. Margaret walked away from the East Wing. She walked past the early tourists who were starting to arrive. She walked past the guards in their red uniforms and their tall black hats. She walked out of the palace into the morning light, and she knew that everything was different now. She knew that the palace she loved had a secret, and she knew that she would never look at it the same way again.
2 days after the hidden office was discovered, Catherine from the security department received a piece of paper. It was a simple piece of paper with a handwriting analysis on it. The handwriting on the documents found in the hidden room matched the handwriting of a man named Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling worked in the palace communications department. He had worked there for 23 years. He had never been in any trouble. He had never caused any problems. He was a quiet man, a professional man, a man who seemed to disappear into the background of palace life. When Catherine read the name, she felt something heavy settle in her chest, because knowing who had done something was different from understanding why they had done it. And Catherine had learned, in her many years of security work, that sometimes the why was more important than the who. Richard Sterling was 52 years old. He lived alone in a flat in Westminster. He had a pension from his previous work in military intelligence. He had no family. He had no close friends that anyone could identify. He was the kind of man who lived a life of solitude. The kind of man who kept his thoughts to himself. The kind of man who nobody really knew. When security officers went to his flat to search it, they found something that made them understand Richard Sterling a little better. The flat was very organized. Everything was in its place. Books lined the shelves in neat rows. But the books were all about history. Palace history, royal history, British history. There were notebooks filled with his handwriting, pages and pages of research, notes about old events, notes about decisions made decades ago, notes about things that had happened when Richard was a young man, before he came to work at the palace. In a desk drawer, they found letters. Letters to historical societies. Letters to university archives. Letters asking questions about palace operations. Letters asking if anyone had information about certain historical events. The letters were polite. The letters were professional. But the letters showed a man who was obsessed with understanding something. A man who was searching for answers to questions that nobody had asked him. Catherine sat in her small office and read through all of Richard Sterling's letters. She read about his questions. She read about what he was searching for. And slowly, she began to understand. Richard Sterling was not a spy. Richard Sterling was not trying to steal secrets to sell to enemies. Richard Sterling was trying to find out the truth about something. Richard Sterling was trying to investigate something that the palace had hidden away. The breakthrough came when they found the letters from outside the palace. Letters from a man named Dr. William Hayes. Dr. Hayes was a historian who worked at Oxford University. The letters showed that Richard and Dr. Hayes had been corresponding for more than a year. Richard was asking questions. Dr. Hayes was providing historical information. They were working together to understand something about palace operations during the Second World War. When security officers contacted Dr. Hayes, he was very honest with them. He explained that Richard had approached him with questions about certain administrative decisions made during wartime. Richard wanted to know if these decisions had been documented. Richard wanted to know if there were historical records of these events. Dr. Hayes explained that he had helped Richard by providing what information he could find in public archives. Dr. Hayes said that Richard was a serious man, a man who cared deeply about historical truth, a man who was not trying to do anything illegal, but was trying to understand something that troubled him. This information changed everything. Catherine went to the king and explained what she had learned. She explained that Richard Sterling was not a criminal in the traditional sense. He was a man who had discovered something in palace records that bothered him. He was a man who had decided to investigate on his own because he did not believe the palace would help him understand it. He was a man who had hidden in a small room and collected documents because he believed the palace would never let him ask his questions openly. The king listened to this explanation very carefully. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he asked Catherine a question. He asked if she believed Richard Sterling was a good man. Catherine thought about the letters. She thought about the research. She thought about a man who had risked his career and his freedom because he believed in the importance of truth. She said yes. She said she believed Richard Sterling was a good man who had done a wrong thing for what he believed were right reasons. On the third day of the investigation, security officers were sent to find Richard Sterling. But when they arrived at his flat, they found that he was not there. His neighbors said they had not seen him for several days. His workplace said he had requested leave. He had simply disappeared. He had known, somehow, that they were looking for him. Or perhaps he had always planned to disappear once his operation was discovered. He had left his flat neat and clean. He had left his research organized. He had left everything in order, as if he was not running away, but simply moving on to the next phase of his life. The police were brought in to search for him. His photograph was circulated to security personnel. His bank accounts were monitored. His contacts were checked. But Richard Sterling had planned his disappearance carefully. He had saved money. He had made arrangements. He had covered his tracks. For 3 days, nobody knew where he was. For 3 days, Catherine and the king waited and wondered if Richard Sterling would ever be found. On the evening of the third day, a message came. Richard Sterling had gone to a small village in the Cotswolds. He had rented a cottage under a false name. He had no intention of running away forever. He was simply waiting. He was waiting for the palace to find him. He was waiting for the moment when he would have to face what he had done. Catherine drove to the cottage herself. She brought no police. She brought no arrest warrant. She brought only herself and a simple message. The king wanted to speak with Richard Sterling, not as a criminal, not as a spy, but as a man, face to face. When Catherine knocked on the door of the cottage, Richard Sterling opened it immediately. He was a thin man with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked like he had not slept well. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He looked at Catherine and nodded, as if he had been expecting her all along. He packed a small bag. He locked the cottage. He got into the car with Catherine. And as they drove back toward London, toward the palace, Richard Sterling finally spoke. He said that he was sorry. He said that he had done wrong. But he said that he would do it again if he had to, because some things were more important than rules. Some things were more important than staying safe. Some things were more important than keeping your job. Catherine listened to him and said nothing, but she understood. She understood that Richard Sterling was a man of conscience, a man who had seen something that bothered him so deeply that he had been willing to sacrifice everything to try to understand it. She understood that what came next would be important, not just for Richard Sterling, but for the entire institution.
Richard Sterling sat in the back of the black car and watched the English countryside pass by. Trees, fields, small villages with houses that had been standing for hundreds of years. The driver did not speak. The security officer sitting in the front seat did not speak. There was only the sound of the car moving along the road and Richard's own breathing, which sounded very loud inside his head. He had known this moment would come. When he had decided to hide in that small room and search for the documents, he had known that someday he would have to face consequences. He had known that he might go to prison. He had known that he might lose his pension. He had known that he might lose everything. But he had also known that some things were more important than staying safe. Some things were more important than keeping your job and your quiet life. Some things were important enough to risk everything for. Richard was 52 years old. He had worked for the palace for 23 years. Before that, he had worked in military intelligence. He had spent his whole adult life serving the crown, serving the institution, serving something bigger than himself. He believed in that service. He believed that there were things worth protecting and fighting for. But he also believed that institutions could be wrong sometimes. He believed that even very old institutions, even the crown itself, could make mistakes. And he believed that when you saw a mistake, you had a responsibility to try to fix it. The car pulled through the palace gates. Richard had come this way many times before, but never like this. Never as a man who had broken the rules. Never as a man who had hidden in a secret room and stolen documents and tried to expose secrets that the palace wanted to keep hidden. His hands were shaking. He put them flat on his legs to try to make them stop shaking. It did not work. A security officer opened the car door. Richard stepped out into the pale gray light. The palace rose up in front of him, huge and solid and important. A building that had been here for more than 200 years. A building that had seen kingdoms rise and fall. A building that had contained the private lives of thousands of people across generations. Richard had loved this building once. He had been proud to work here. Now he was not sure what he felt. He was taken through corridors that were not open to the public, through doors that had secret locks, upstairs that did not appear on the official maps of the palace. Finally, he arrived at a small room that was very simple and very quiet. Just a few chairs, a small table, large windows that looked out over the gardens. Nothing fancy, nothing decorated, just a room where important conversations happened. And then the king came in. Richard had seen the king many times before, of course. He had been in rooms where the king was present, but he had never been alone with him. Never had the king's full attention focused on him alone. He stood up because that was what you did. His legs felt weak. His mouth felt dry. He tried to think of something to say, but no words came. The king was an older man now, with gray hair and a lined face. He had the kind of face that had seen a lot of responsibility, the kind of face that had learned to keep feelings hidden. But his eyes were kind. That was the thing that surprised Richard. He had expected the king to look angry. He had expected disappointment. He had expected coldness. but the king's eyes were kind. The king sat down and gestured for Richard to sit down too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The king looked at Richard for a very long time. Richard could not look away. He could not look down. He had to meet the king's eyes, and he had to accept whatever judgment he saw there. Finally, the king spoke. His voice was quiet and calm. He asked Richard why he had done it. Not in an angry way, in a way that seemed like he actually wanted to understand. Richard opened his mouth, and words came out. Not smooth words, not careful words, just honest words. He talked about the documents he had discovered references to. He talked about the historical records that he believed had been hidden. He talked about his belief that institutions grew stronger, not weaker, when they were honest about their past. He talked about his fear that the palace was building its authority on a foundation of secrets. And as he talked, tears came to his eyes. He did not try to stop them. He did not try to be strong. He just spoke the truth, and the tears came, and the king listened. Richard explained that he had not been trying to hurt anyone. He had not been trying to damage the crown. He had been trying to help the crown be better. He had been trying to help the institution he loved so much see that hiding the truth was not the same as protecting the truth. He had been trying to do something brave, and he had known it would probably destroy him, but he had believed it was important. When Richard finished speaking, the king was quiet for a long time. Then the king stood up and walked to the window. He looked out over the gardens. Richard did not know what the king was thinking. He did not know if the king was angry or disappointed or sad. He just waited. Finally, the king turned around and looked at Richard again. And the king said something that Richard would remember for the rest of his life. The king said that Richard had been both right and wrong. Right to care about truth. Wrong to hide in the shadows to find it. But the king said that he understood Richard's heart. The king said that he understood why Richard had done what he had done. And the king said that the palace needed people like Richard, people who loved it enough to challenge it. Then the king explained what would happen. Richard would cooperate fully. Richard would tell them everything. Richard would help them find and secure the documents he had been investigating. In exchange, Richard would not be prosecuted. Richard would not go to prison. But Richard would also have to leave. Richard would have to agree never to speak publicly about what he had done. Richard would have to understand that this was a negotiation, not a reward. It was the king's choice to show mercy, and that mercy came with conditions. Richard felt something break open inside his chest, not in a bad way, in a way that felt like relief and sadness at the same time. He had expected to lose everything, but instead, he was being offered a way out. He was being offered a chance to do the right thing and live. He was being offered understanding from the man he had tried to expose. Richard said yes. He said he agreed. He said he would do whatever the king asked. And the king nodded, and Richard knew that his old life was over, but his conscience was finally at peace. The king had listened. The king had understood. And somehow that was enough. 3 months passed. 3 months of quiet work. 3 months of things happening behind closed doors. 3 months of the palace trying to return to normal, even though nothing would ever be truly normal again. The tourists still came. The ceremonies still happened. The guards still stood in their red uniforms. But everyone who worked inside the palace knew that something fundamental had changed. Something had shifted in the foundation. Something that could not be put back the way it was before. Margaret Hendricks returned to work after 2 weeks at home. She had stayed in her small flat in South London and did not answer her phone for the first few days. She had sat in her kitchen and drunk tea and tried to understand what had happened. Her son had called her. Her daughter-in-law had called her. They wanted to know if everything was okay. They wanted to help. But Margaret could not explain it to them. How do you explain that you found a secret in the place where you had worked for 31 years? How do you explain that your quiet life had become part of something important and strange? When Margaret returned to the palace, James, the security officer, met her at the staff entrance. He thanked her. He told her that what she had done had been brave and important. He told her that the palace recognized her service. But Margaret did not feel brave. She felt tired. She felt like something inside her had been broken, and she was not sure if it could be fixed. The door to room 347 was sealed. A new lock had been installed, a modern lock with electronic sensors. The old brass lock, the one that had started everything, was gone. Margaret never saw it again. She never knew where it went. But she thought about it sometimes. She thought about how one small broken lock had changed everything. Richard Sterling left the palace on a Thursday afternoon. No one gave him a party. No one said goodbye in a big way. He simply packed his desk in the communications department and walked out. But Catherine, the woman from security, was waiting for him at the gate. She shook his hand. She told him that she admired what he had done, even though she could not say that officially. She told him that institutions needed people like him. She told him that she hoped he would understand why things had to happen the way they did. Richard smiled for the first time in months. It was a sad smile, but a real one. He said that he understood. He said that sometimes doing the right thing meant losing things you loved. He said that he had lost his job and his home and his place in the palace, but he had gained something too. He had gained the knowledge that he had tried to do something good. He had gained the respect of people he admired. He had gained peace. He took a plane to Canada 3 weeks later. He had a job waiting for him at an archive in Toronto. The job did not pay as much as his palace job. The job did not have the prestige. The job did not have a history. But the job had something else. It had honesty. It had a place where people worked to make historical information available to everyone, not hidden away in secret rooms. Richard settled into a small apartment in Toronto and started his new life. He never spoke publicly about what had happened. He never wrote about it. He never told anyone the details. But the people who knew him said he was a changed man. He was quieter. He was sadder. But he was also more at peace. 2 months after Richard left, the king made a public announcement. It was not a big announcement. It was not dramatic. It was simply a statement that the palace had decided to open certain historical archives to scholars and researchers. The announcement said that the palace believed institutions were strengthened by transparency. The announcement said that the crown was committed to supporting legitimate historical inquiry. No one mentioned Richard Sterling. No one mentioned the hidden room. No one mentioned the broken lock. But everyone who knew what had really happened understood what the announcement meant. The palace had listened. The palace had changed. A new position was created in the palace structure. The Director of Historical Integrity. This person would oversee the archival review process. This person would work with universities and research institutions. This person would make sure that the palace was honest about its history. The king took this responsibility very seriously. He understood that what had almost become a scandal had instead become an opportunity for the institution to become better. Margaret was invited to meet the king 4 months after she had found the broken lock. She was very nervous. She had never met the king before. She had worked in his palace for 31 years, but she had never actually met him. She was taken to the same simple room where Richard Sterling had met with him. She wore her best dress. She had her hair done. She tried to be brave. The king was kind to her. He asked her questions about her life. He asked about her son and her grandchildren. He thanked her personally for her vigilance and her honesty. He told her that she had done something important. He told her that the palace was grateful. And then he told her something that made her cry. He told her that she was the reason the palace could trust itself again. He told her that her act of noticing something wrong, of speaking up, of being brave enough to report it, had made the institution stronger. Margaret could not speak. She just nodded. She just let the tears come, because she realized in that moment that what she had done was not a bad thing. She had not broken the palace. She had actually helped save it. She had helped the palace become a place where truth mattered more than secrets. After that meeting, Margaret returned to her work. She continued to walk the corridors of the palace. She continued to notice things. She continued to care for the building she loved. But now she knew that if she saw something wrong again, she would speak up. She would not be afraid, because the king had told her that being honest was brave. Being honest was important. Being honest was what held an institution together. Years later, Margaret would retire. She would leave the palace and spend time with her grandchildren. But she would never forget the morning she found the broken lock. She would never forget the hidden room. She would never forget that she had been the person who started something that changed everything. And sometimes, when she was an old woman sitting in her garden in South London, she would think about Richard Sterling working in his archive in Canada, and she would wonder if he was happy. She would wonder if he missed the palace. She would wonder if he knew that what he had done had mattered, not just to him, but to the institution itself. The palace continued on, as palaces do. The ceremonies continued. The tourists came and went. The guards stood at their posts. But now there was something new inside the walls. Now there was a commitment to truth. Now there was an understanding that institutions could only be strong if they were willing to listen to the people who saw problems. Now there was the memory of a broken lock and all the change that came from noticing it. And that was how the palace learned to be honest with itself.